What's your take on that? Mr. Finkelstein talks about it a bit, but what are your feelings?
I mean, it is so obvious that it's hard even to discuss. I mean, just take a look at the concern about the Holocaust, say in the United States, but it's duplicated elsewhere, Israel too. There was a time when it made sense to be concerned about the Holocaust. I'm old enough to remember it very vividly. First of all, before the war, when you could have saved potential Holocaust victims. And they were kept out of the country, driven back to Europe. The case of the St. Louis is a famous one. The conferences on refugees, Avion and elsewhere, the main conclusion was send them somewhere else. We don't want to bother with them. So if they get slaughtered, that's their problem. After the war, you could argue during the war that maybe there were higher priorities. Okay, I don't agree, but you could argue that. After the war, there were no higher priorities. In 1945, Holocaust survivors were living in concentration camps under miserable conditions, not much different from the war, except that the crematoria and the gas chambers weren't functioning. Truman actually sent a commission, a Harrison Commission, to investigate the camps and came back with awful reports about what was going on in the camps. Well, ask yourself a simple question. How many of the survivors of the Holocaust in the camps came to the United States? A trickle. How many would have wanted to come to the United States? Well, we don't actually know, but half of Europe would have wanted to come to the United States at that point for obvious reasons. And survivors of the death camps, it's very likely that a large number of them, probably maybe most of them, would have come here if they had a chance. Well, they didn't have a chance for two reasons. One reason, which is by now well documented in Hebrew and in English, is that the Jewish community in Palestine, the Yishuv, was pre-Israel, had essentially taken over the camps. And they wanted to ensure that they had actually, they controlled the camps, meaning they controlled food and so on. They basically ran them. And their goal was straightforward: get the able-bodied ones to go to Palestine. In fact, there's a book which in the Hebrew translation, it's called Good Human Material. It appeared in English with some other title, I forget what. The phrase good human material comes from the doctrine that people, able-bodied men and women from 17 to 35, have to go to Palestine, basically cannon fodder, and the rest we'll use for propaganda. So that's one reason why they didn't come here. The other reason, which is more important for us, is that the Americans didn't want them. They did not want them to come. The American Jewish community didn't want them to come. There was practically no lobby. Actually, there was an immigration bill, the Stratton immigration bill, but as far as I recall, the only elements of the Jewish community that lobbied for it were the anti-Zionist groups, the Council for Judaism, Blessing Rosenwald, anti-Zionist. Well, you know, that was a time when you could have saved Holocaust survivors. Nobody cared. In fact, it was negative. We don't want them. Then you look through the 50s, and Holocaust is barely discussed. It's not much of an issue. Eichmann trial, there's a little tick. There's some discussion of it. But the huge change is in 1967. Just trace the... now there's a Holocaust museum in every town. There are obligatory Holocaust studies in schools, you know, and so on. Just ask when there's huge literature. Just time it. Well, post-1967. What happened in 1967? It's pretty obvious. Israel had taken over the occupied territories. It had won a major military victory. That won at a lot of points here, being a powerful state wins you points, especially when you're an ally. It needed a justification for denying Palestinian rights and for its illegal settlement programs in the territories. There's no serious debate about their illegality. I could go into it, but the Israeli government itself pretty much recognized it in 1967, said we're going to go on anyway. But had to have a justification for that. And what better justification is there than look what they did to us? we're free to do anything. And that was, I mean, exploiting the Holocaust as an instrument of oppression of others is just the ultimate obscenity. And there were people who recognized this. My late friend, the late Israel Shachak, Israel's leading human rights activist, and incidentally bitterly slandered and condemned by Dershowitz even as much as Finkelstein. It's an interesting story in itself. But he was a survivor of the Warsaw Ghetto and Bergen-Belsen, got to Israel, Israeli citizen. But after '67, he reacted differently. His reaction wasn't things like this shouldn't happen to us. It's that they shouldn't happen to anybody. And he became a strong, very effective civil rights activist for Palestinian rights, women's rights, other rights. In the early years, he was bitterly detested. There was an effort to try to kick him out of his university position. There was even an article in the press saying somebody should put a bomb over his laboratory door. Vilified. There were efforts to destroy his little civil rights group and so on. In later years, he came to be respected. In fact, he was around 1990, I guess. They select one survivor every year to be honored on the day of the memory of the day of the Holocaust. He was the person picked. His autobiography was published, and so on. He was a respected figure, but not in the early years. Well, that was a different reaction to '67 but the overwhelming one was what I described. And it's easy to trace. I mean, it's so easy to trace that it's even pointless to discuss. You take a look at the journals articles. I mean, any criterion you want. '67 is the turning point. Not because the Holocaust became more important. It was much more important in the late 40s, or the early 40s for that matter. And then, who cares? We don't want to save those survivors. But when it became useful as an instrument to justify oppression, then it became an overwhelming issue. And a lot of grandstanding, and we have to defend the memory of the Holocaust from nobody, because nobody denies it, and so on. In fact, there was a major effort to try to discover Holocaust deniers